Affairs, where he was directly in charge of diaspora affairs. A student of international relations, he did his MA and MPhil from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Sri Mishra is currently engaged in doctoral research in Cornell University. Sri Mishra's pastime includes music, photography, swimming, and nature trail. Besides, he is an avid public speaker and has spoken in a number of forums at home and abroad. Some of his lectures on Vedanta, meditation, and yoga are available on YouTube. While in Hungary, he set up the first and only Vedanta society by any diplomatic mission in the world. Being a passionate advocate of Ayurveda, Sri Mishra was instrumental in setting up 2 chairs of Ayurveda in eminent universities of Trinidad and Hungary, and is currently facilitating the establishment of the first ever European Institute of Ayurvedic Sciences in Hungary. Sir, in short, he is the face of our country to the outside world. Young Indian is working towards setting a positive mindset at the root level so that our country can be a developed country, and we would like you to share your views on how the young Indians can be a part of Insurgent India. Mr. Malay Mishra, round of applause, please.
I hope you said Resurgent India or Insurgent India? I speak to this?
Yes, sir.
This can be taken out.
Hello, hello.
To this. Good evening to you all.
Good evening, sir.
I was told there will be many more people. Maybe they have all gone out to different directions. But never mind. They must be all enjoying Puri and its environment. Well, I'm a resident of Puri, so I will only promote my own little town, which is one of the 4 dhams, as we say, pilgrimage centers. So if you haven't been to Jagannath Mandir yet, you should pay a visit and render your homage to Lord Jagannath. The entire state of Odisha lives and dies for Lord Jagannath. Jagannath culture is so pervasive in this part of the world. Puri also has other facilities, and we have a wonderful beach right in front of you. The Bay of Bengal is at its most beautiful form here. It extends all the way to Konark from here. One of the longest beaches in the world, where you can walk straight away from Puri to Konark. It will take you about 5-6 hours for a walk, but you can reach Konark on the seaside. We have also what we call Marine Drive, some kind of our own Marine Drive, which joins Puri with Konark. And at this time, there's a good festival going on in Konark. It's called Konark Festival, Dance Festival. And today is the last day of the festival. So, of course, it's now clashing. It's just about to begin there. Otherwise, I would have advised all of you to stop listening to me and go there. It was really good. Well, thank you for this very kind introduction on your part. I have been associated with CII for almost 25 years, and wherever I have been posted, I have seen to it that we get a CII delegation to come and promote Indian industry, various aspects of that in the countries where I have represented and served. My last mission was, of course, in Budapest, as you mentioned, and just weeks to go before I retired, there was a CIA delegation who was visiting Budapest and various other places. We took them around. It was a multi-sectoral delegation. So it was very interesting and important, because many times what happens is the industry bodies, because CII being the apex body, gets cut off from the missions, and it's a very bad disconnect. And we have raised with CII again and again that this is not good. We must be working in synergy, because missions cannot function and cannot promote economic diplomacy unless the levers of economic diplomacy are available to us. And the industry bodies like CII or FICCI or ASSOCHAM, these are very important for us. So what we normally do is, like what I have done is, whenever I take over a mission, I set up a business office where we organize business meetings, conferences, various delegations to meet when they come. I also have a permanent business center where we run various films from time to time of CII or FICCI. We have elaborate databases from these bodies, and we put them in touch with various organizations, the counterpart organizations the country is concerned, because we feel that is important. Otherwise, how do missions promote India economically in terms of cultural and trade or commercial and trade ties? But many times we do not get the required cooperation from these bodies because of many reasons. That is lagging, and I have flagged it with no less than the Director General, Chandrajit Banerjee himself, who happens to be quite well known to me. But that apart, I think the initiative of CII coming out with this body, which is your body, which is Young India, is very laudable. I know that this started in 2002, so you come to nearly 13 years until now, and I'm sure you had a lot many experiences as members of this group to help out in a way, promote entrepreneurship, to cover the distant land what we are, various corners of India, what you're going to do, how you're going to do. Various things. I believe you have some missions also where you go out and to interact with various industry bodies, various other universities, other educational places, and then you have come out with various missions of late, like Mission Swachh Bharat, which is taking on a very, very important initiative of the Prime Minister, and also some other mission like Masoom or something I was reading somewhere, where you are trying to connect with the younger population of the country. So having got all that background, I think it's easy for you to connect with India. I do not know how many of you come from relatively poorer backgrounds. When I mean poor, I am talking of about 30% of India's population who are downright poor, who do not get even 2 square meals a day. We are come to that situation where even after nearly 70 years of our national independence, we cannot feed 30% of our population properly. We have a very disparate growth, where we have maybe 15% or even less at the cream. They are the creamy layer, what you would say, in economic terms also. And they are the rest of the crowd who are in different stages of impoverization. Going down to the slums. I do not know how many of you, I'm sure all of you would be knowing about slums, right? You must be encountering slums in your day-to-day life, I'm sure. But I'm not sure how many of you have visited a slum. Can you raise your hands if anybody has visited? Oh, all of you have visited. Have you seen the kind of life? I'm not talking of big slums like Dharavi. I'm talking of small shanties, like, there is one Rajiv Gandhi shanty in Delhi, in the heart of Delhi, near Chanakyapuri, and there are many other shanty towns, where if you go inside and see that kind of lives of those people, you would feel either they are living on the face of this earth or we are living. Because both of us coexisting on the same land is some kind of a miracle, some kind of an aberration, if I may say so. So here I start. What would be your role in a way bringing about development in a holistic manner for the entire society? I'm not going to give you any pontificatory ideas, not at all. I will basically lead you through a discussion of what we have encountered in various parts of the world compared to India, because that has been my métier so far. In Africa, I have seen abject poverty. I lived for 2 years in this country called Senegal. It was relatively advanced for us. There are other parts of Africa which are in dire poverty. You will be surprised that in Hungary, where I served my last mission, there is a lot of poverty. Though Hungary is in the heart of Europe and supposedly a key member of the 28-member European Union, and they are very developed, as you know. EU is overall very developed, and India has a very strong, robust partnership with the EU. But yet, there are certain countries who are, in my view, not performing very well on the social indicators, in the sense that they cannot, or maybe they do not, take into account all sections of their population. And here there is one particular neglected community of those countries, particularly in Central Europe, which are the so-called Roma communities. And it's a long story. It's a subject of my PhD work now, on which I'm working for a university in Budapest, and I'm right in the middle of it, where I have collected some data which is simply unbelievable. The way they are living, the way they are being thrown around, the way they are being marginalized, and everything is happening under the nose of the governments. And these national governments are supposed to have evolved national schemes for their upliftment under the EU impetus, for which EU has come out with two schemes, two decade schemes. One decade is just getting over, a decade of social inclusion, and there's another scheme which is running simultaneously, that national integration strategy. National integration strategy is even a much bigger scheme, where EU is pumping money into those governments, to all the member countries, all the 28 member countries, because these communities live everywhere. And would you believe it that they originated from India? They are the so-called gypsies. And long time ago, maybe 1,200 years ago, they migrated from India. It was a pushing out migration, where they didn't want to migrate, but under Islamic rule, where the people who came to subjugate India in some way or the other, they took along these people as slaves, as semi-slaves. They worked for them. They worked in the camps. They did all kinds of menial jobs, though they are very skilled. They were artistic. They are very good in fine arts, in cultural artifacts. They develop a lot. They are good at handicrafts. Their skills are amazing even now, which they have preserved. But they passed through a trajectory through the Middle East, through Turkey, and into Europe through the Balkans, through southern Europe. Then they moved into Europe, Spain, to the western side of Europe, and finally through the Balkans, which are all predominantly part Muslim and part Christian countries. They entered Central Europe. And this all happened through the 13th till about 17th, 18th century. So they are well penetrated, integrated into European societies where they are living, and we have about, today's count should be about 8 to 10 million of these people. And for Europe it's a big number. And globally there could be more than 15 million, because they are even found in America, in Mexico, in Canada, in many parts of South America, practically all over the world. They have forgotten that they ever came from India. Though there are genetic links to prove that, there are philological links to prove that. Their language, what they speak, is very, very similar to Hindi. Many of the words come directly from Hindi, so we can think, and basically the ethnic links also, they look very much like you and I. Because of the skin color, because of the hair, kind of hair they have, the dress they wear, and you won't think that these are foreigners if they were in India. The only thing they are living in different habitats outside of India. But the point which I am driving at is all societies have some kind of fault line somewhere, some kind of loophole somewhere, and they do something for them or they cover them up. Now coming to India, where we are so-called emerging economy or a resurgent nation, we need to do a lot of thinking, and I will provoke you. I'll provoke you to thinking because you have come all in a generation which, of course, hasn't seen the toil which went into making a country independent. But that apart, after that also there have been two generations which have come. And you perhaps belong to the third generation or maybe fourth generation who is come post-independence. What happened in terms of national development is that post-independence there was a big scramble, there was a big disorder, as we all know. In 1947 there was a huge event called the partition of the subcontinent. And thanks to the British, they put a permanent scar, two scars on both sides of our country. One scar which carved out a country called West Pakistan, and the other which carved out a country called East Pakistan. And both these countries, of course, they joined up because they're part of one group. And I just amazed at the British genius of thinking that over 2,000 kilometers, both these parts of the subcontinent could stay together, despite several diversities among them, principally linguistic, ethnic, even physical, geological, and what have you. But the British thought, okay, we can partition India into two parts because these are the people who are permanently quarreling, and they are still quarreling today also. So let us put a wedge, because at that time the British, of course, they said, okay, we give you back India because, well, my theory is they had to give back. Of course, Gandhiji has done his lifelong struggle for all of us. He has used his techniques of peace and nonviolence and truth and all that. Very ethical way of looking at a political struggle, at a liberation struggle. But I think that has given us a kind of bedrock, a moral high ground. And Pandit Nehru, the first Prime Minister, came up on that moral bedrock to look at the world from a very different mindset and different eyes. And when he came up with this non-aligned principle, we actually, India was leading the world at the time, in the sense that not only were we leading the developing world in terms of all the other countries who were in similar fate like us, but we are also challenging the domination of the West and the East, the so-called first and the second worlds. So we were carving out a niche for ourselves in another world, which we call the non-aligned world. It's still there. It's called G77 now. Of course, it has about 115 members, but still calls itself Group of 77 because it was the first name. But that apart, that high ground of India, as you would have seen today, in today's India, is not there anymore. Mr. Modi is trying very hard to regenerate that high ground. He's trying his best, I must say. In my view, there has been a big void between Nehru and Modi. Nehru passed away in '64 and Modi appeared on the national scene in 2014. So there was a clear 15-year void. There was half a century of gap. And what did you have in that gap economically? You had a statism of the economy where the state managed everything for about 10 years, where you had all the big industries come up, the big infrastructures come up, all the institutes come up, thanks to Nehru and Patel's very visionary plans for India, and they all came up during that time, 60s. Then came a time when there was state-managed economy. It was a little different, that you had the state as the principal organ which was directing everything. So they were laying out policies and they were laying out guidelines. They were saying, okay, you work like this, and others, actors had to work like that. So this was also a stage which ran during Mrs. Indira Gandhi's time, I would say, broadly. And then you had a deterioration of that into crony capitalism. Crony capitalism thrived on a kind of a class which was patronized by the state in some way or the other for some interests which they were serving, both sides. And these were these crony capitalists who wanted to keep everything in their hands, and they won't let others come in. And these were the time which was perhaps the lowest point of our economic development, this particular phase of crony capitalism, which ran through Mrs. Gandhi's last part and Rajiv Gandhi's full time, a little unto Narasimha Rao's prime ministership, and finally gave way to the 90s, early 90s, when we actually had some kind of a liberal market economy come into being. Now what is happening in India is, as you would have seen on the social side, there's a lot of turmoil in India, and you would ask me why I'm saying that. It seems to us that our society is passing through a very, very difficult phase. You have very disproportionate growth of the economy, as I pointed out in the beginning. You have a very asymmetrical system of governance, because governance is favoring a particular set of people and totally disregarding another set of people. You have a very skewed judicial system, where there are at this point of time 300,000 cases pending before the Supreme Court and other high courts, because there are no particular judges to take them on. You have a very rampantly aggressive media, which is just going overboard with whatever happens to sensationalize that and get their TRP ratings. You had a very weak civil society, if I may say so, which I think, in my view, is very, very sad situation, because it seems to me that the civil society is at permanent loggerheads with the leaderships, with the state. This is not fair. This is not done. In other developed countries, you have a well-developed civil society which sits on the same table and which is a partner. But here, we do not have a civil society which holds partnership with the state. We have a civil society which, when it starts uttering something positive, it is put behind bars, or its voices are muffled, or something happens and the man just goes into oblivion. We have numerous cases like that. I may not tell you all that, you know it very well.